The invitation did not arrive with a thunderclap or a cosmic omen. It arrived on a humid Tuesday afternoon in the New Geneva administrative sector, tucked between a requisition order for synthetic soil and a routine weather alert warning of an impending localized cyclone. Dr. Aris Thorne had spent the better part of 2 decades deciphering the silent languages of the stars, but the message from the convergence left her staring at the holographic display until her eyes burned. Humanity was invited to the Ossuary. In the grand hierarchy of the galaxy, the Ossuary was a myth carved in bone-white ceramic and reinforced carbon nanotubes. It was a neutral ground, a massive station suspended in the Lagrange point of a dying star, designed specifically to host the extremophile convergence. It was a place where the galaxy's most terrifying mistakes gathered to discuss the mechanics of not dying. Aris adjusted her glasses, the frames a relic of pre-expansion Earth. Behind her, the air conditioning unit hummed a low, struggling tune, fighting the 60% humidity that was standard for the Central European biosphere. She read the classification once more. Observers. "We are being invited as guests to watch the big boys play," Aris muttered, her voice a dry rasp. She tapped a command, sending the files to the United Sol Defense Command. Within 3 hours, she was sitting in a pressurized shuttle next to a man who looked like he had been assembled from spare parts and grit. Commander Jax Vance was a Void Marine who had survived 3 separate hull breaches and a localized uprising on the Jovian moons. He was currently occupied with cleaning a short-barreled kinetic pistol that looked far too primitive for a diplomatic mission. "Stow that, Commander," Aris said, gesturing to the weapon. "We are going to a peace summit, not a trench war." Vance didn't look up. He moved with a heavy, deliberate precision, his cybernetic left hand clicking softly as it cycled the firing pin. "Peace is just the time you spend reloading, Doc. Besides, I have seen the intel on the other guests. We are heading into a room filled with things that eat kinetic energy for breakfast. I am not going in naked." 3 days later, the shuttle docked at the Ossuary. As the airlock hissed open, the environment hit Aris like a physical blow. The air was too thin, recycled through filters that tasted of ozone and sterile chemicals. The station was a masterpiece of impossible engineering, a series of interconnected habitats, each a tiny hell tailored for a specific nightmare. They were met by Administrator Kalik, a spindly being whose skin shimmered with a pale, translucent luminescence. Kalik was a member of the High Council species, those who had evolved on Goldilocks worlds where the weather was predictable and the predators followed the rules. "Welcome, representatives of the crucible," Kalik said, the translator around its neck turning its melodic chirps into a hollow, synthesized English. "We are surprised by your prompt arrival. There was a lingering debate regarding the validity of your inclusion." Aris stepped forward, her boots clicking on the metallic floor. "You invited us. We are here." Kalik's skin flickered a nervous shade of violet. "Indeed. However, the lithoderms, the gale stalkers, and the abyssal synapse are currently in the primary viewing chamber. They were under the impression this summit was reserved for Category 10 environments. Your world, Sol 3, was originally logged as a Category 4. Stable, if somewhat volatile in its tectonic shifts." Aris felt a familiar, weary pride stir in her chest. "And why the change?" Kalik hesitated, gesturing for them to follow down a corridor that seemed to vibrate with the sheer power required to maintain the surrounding habitats. "A recent deep scan survey by our autonomous probes. They monitored your planet for an entire solar cycle. They saw the great permafrost melt followed immediately by the century fires. They witnessed the way your biosphere does not just adapt, but actively retaliates against dominant life forms. The High Council has redesignated the crucible as a Category 0. Jax Vance whistled through his teeth. "Category 0? Never heard of it." "That is because we had to invent it for you," Kalik replied. "It is not a death world of constant heat or constant cold. It is a world of apocalyptic transitions. It is an unsurvivable environment because it never stays the same long enough to be mastered." They reached the central hub, a vast sphere of reinforced glass. Beyond the glass, the 3 primary delegations waited. To the left, the lithoderms stood like jagged statues of obsidian. They were silicon-based giants from Crag Prime, a world with 4 times Earth's gravity and a surface temperature that melted lead. They didn't breathe. They absorbed minerals through their skin. In the center, the Gale Stalkers paced within a pressurized wind tunnel. They were lean, multi-limbed predators with hollow bones and sensory whiskers that could detect a heartbeat through a hurricane. On their homeworld, the wind never dropped below 200 kilometers per hour. To them, silence was a vacuum. To the right, a massive tank of dark, pressurized liquid held the abyssal synapse. They were bioluminescent webs of neural tissue, evolved in the crushing depths of a trench 10 kilometers deep. Their world was a chemical soup that would dissolve a human in seconds. The human platform was situated in the center, a modest patch of standard gravity and breathable air. It felt incredibly vulnerable, a small bubble of fragility in a sea of monsters. As Aris, Jax, and the recently arrived Dr. Alara Vance took their positions, every eye, sensor, and thermal pit in the room focused on them. A lithoderm moved toward the glass, its voice a grinding of tectonic plates translated into a deep, echoing rumble. "Why have you brought these soft skins here, Administrator? They look like they would burst under a modest atmospheric shift. They are made of water and hope. They are prey." Jax Vance didn't flinch. He leaned against the railing, his eyes scanning the lithoderm's rocky exterior. "We are not prey, big guy. We are just the only ones in this room who don't need a specialized fish tank to keep from dying." The room went silent. The Gale Stalkers stopped their pacing. The abyssal synapse pulsed with a rhythmic, angry light. Aris stepped to the console, activating the human introductory data. "We didn't come here to measure our muscles against yours," she said, her voice steady. "We came here because the crucible taught us one thing that your worlds never could. You are all masters of your specific hells. But the universe is a place of change. And when the fire goes out, or the wind stops, or the pressure drops, you will die." She looked at the obsidian giant. "We are the ones who know how to live through the transition." Kalik's skin turned a terrified shade of white. "I believe," he stammered, "that it is time for the opening session to begin." The dining hall of the Ossuary was a testament to the galaxy's obsession with segregation. Each species sat within its own environmental bubble, separated by fields of force and reinforced glass. The lithoderms were currently bathing in a pool of molten salts, absorbing ions through their stony carapaces. The Gale Stalkers were tearing into raw, nutrient-rich meat slabs while being buffeted by a simulated gale. The humans sat at a simple table in the communal neutral zone. "Doctor?" Alara Vance was currently rummaging through a backpack that looked like it had been through a war zone. She pulled out a small metallic thermos and a sealed plastic container filled with dark, irregularly shaped discs. "Alara, what are you doing?" Aris asked, rubbing her temples. "The diplomats from the Altair system are already staring at us like we are a biology experiment gone wrong." "I am preparing my morning ritual, Aris. If I have to listen to the lithoderms talk about mineral density for another 4 hours without a stimulant, I am going to develop a personality disorder," Alara replied. She unscrewed the thermos, and the aroma of roasted coffee beans drifted through the air. In the neutral zone, the scent was an anomaly. It was rich, earthy, and chemically complex. A Gale Stalker, its name translated as swift wind, approached the edge of its enclosure. It pressed its snout against the force field, its nostrils flaring. "What is that caustic vapor? It smells like charred organic matter and low-grade fuel." "This?" Alara held up the thermos, a mischievous glint in her eyes. "This is coffee. It is an infusion made from the roasted seeds of a plant that grows in the volcanic soil of our homeworld." Swift Wind tilted its head. "Volcanic soil? Those regions are usually highly toxic. I detect alkaloids, specifically caffeine. That is a potent neurotoxin designed by the plant to paralyze insects and deter mammals." Alara took a long, deliberate sip, sighing with genuine pleasure. "Exactly, we love it. It stimulates our central nervous system, helps us think faster. If we don't have it, we get headaches and become quite irritable." The lithoderms had stopped their salt bath. Their leader, the obsidian giant named Crag Hewer, turned its faceted head toward the humans. "You consume toxins for recreation? Wait until you see the snacks," Alara said, opening the plastic container. "These are chocolate. They contain theobromine. It is lethal to almost every other species on our planet. Dogs, cats, birds. It stops their hearts. But to us, it is a luxury. We give it as a gift to show affection. Jax Vance reached over and grabbed a piece of chocolate, popping it into his mouth. It is a bit bitter, Ilara. Did you get the 80% cocoa again? Only the best for a Deathworld summit, she grinned. The alien delegates moved closer to their respective barriers. The concept of a species that deliberately consumed its own planet's chemical weapons for a morning pick-me-up was clearly not in their briefing files. Administrator Kalik hovered nearby, his skin a chaotic swirl of confused colors. Dr. Vance, I must insist that you exercise caution. If any of those substances were to leak into the station's ventilation system, we would have a diplomatic catastrophe. The Gale Stalker's respiratory systems are incredibly sensitive to alkaloids. Relax, Kalik, Jax said, his voice a low rumble. We have been keeping our toxins contained for 10,000 years. We are experts at not poisoning our neighbors. Usually. But why? Swiftwind asked, its voice a series of sharp, clicking barks. Evolution is a process of efficiency. Why would your biology waste energy developing resistances to toxins that have no nutritional value? Because our world didn't give us a choice, Aris answered, stepping into the conversation. The crucible is a battlefield of chemistry. If we didn't learn to process the poison, we didn't eat. Eventually, we stopped just surviving it and started enjoying the challenge. We didn't just adapt to the environment, we domesticated the danger. She stood up and walked toward the viewing screen that displayed Earth's historical data. She pulled up an image of a human climbing a vertical rock face without ropes. This is called free soloing, she said. There is no biological necessity for this. This man is not hunting. He is not escaping a predator. He is putting his life at risk for the sake of the endorphin rush. Craig Hewer made a sound like grinding gravel. Endorphins? The body's natural painkillers, Ilara added. Our brains are hardwired to reward us with pleasure when we survive a near-death experience. We are addicted to the feeling of not dying. The abyssal synapse in the tank pulsed a deep, ominous red. The translator struggled with the concept. You seek out the void? You invite the end to touch you, simply to feel the rebound of life? Pretty much, Jax said, leaning back in his chair. It makes us very difficult to intimidate. You can threaten to kill us, but you have to understand. Our planet has been trying to do that since we were monkeys. At this point, it is just background noise. The atmosphere in the dining hall changed. The initial contempt had evaporated, replaced by a wary, uncomfortable fascination. These were not the soft skins the Coalition had described. These were something far more dangerous, generalists who had weaponized their own fragility. Suddenly, a low-frequency vibration rattled the table. The coffee in Ilara's thermos rippled. Kalik turned around, his skin flashing a panicked emergency red. That shouldn't be happening. The station's inertial dampeners are rated for Category 12 seismic events. Jax Vance was on his feet in a second, his hand instinctively hovering near the holster of his kinetic pistol. That wasn't a seismic event, Kalik. That was an impact. The lights in the dining hall flickered once, twice, and then died. In the sudden darkness, the only light came from the panicked bioluminescence of the abyssal synapse and the glowing mineral veins of the lithoderms. Then, the emergency klaxons began to scream. "This is the bridge," a voice crackled over the station's intercom, thick with terror. "We have a hull breach in Sector 7. Unidentified boarding craft detected. They are not responding to hails. They are absorbing the station's power grid." "The entropy scourge," Aris whispered, her blood running cold. "They are here early." Jax gripped Aris's shoulder, his cybernetic hand locking with a metallic click. "Doc, get the gear. Ilara, seal the packs." He looked toward the glass enclosures where the most terrifying species in the galaxy were now huddled in confusion, their specialized environments failing as the power was siphoned away. "Hey, rock eaters! Storm chasers!" Jax roared over the sirens. "The lights are out, and the monsters are under the bed. You can sit there and wait for your tanks to fail, or you can listen to the people who know how to fight in the dark." For the first time in the history of the Ossuary, the Deathworlders didn't look at the humans as prey. They looked at them as a lifeline. Move, Jax commanded. We are going to show these bastards how the people of the Crucible handle a bad Tuesday. The silence that follows a catastrophic power failure in deep space has a specific oily texture. It is not the absence of sound, but the sudden prominence of sounds that should never be heard. The groan of cooling metal, the frantic clicking of redundant relays, and the ragged, uneven breathing of three humans who had spent their lives expecting the floor to drop out from under them. Dr. Aris Thorne stood in the center of the darkened dining hall, her eyes adjusting to the dim, bioluminescent emergency glow. Around her, the masters of the galaxy were falling apart. The lithoderms, those jagged monuments of obsidian and strength, had become frozen statues. Their internal heaters, powered by the station's grid, had flatlined. On their homeworld of Crag Prime, a temperature drop of even 50 degrees was a death sentence for their silicon-based biology. Crag Hewer, the giant who had called them prey only an hour ago, was radiating a palpable sense of tectonic terror. His faceted skin was turning a dull, matte gray, a sign of thermal shock. To the left, the Gale Stalkers were worse. Their wind tunnels had died, and the sudden, absolute stillness of the air was causing them to hyperventilate. One of them, Swift Wind, was clawing at the reinforced glass of his enclosure, his multi-limbed body twitching in a rhythmic, frantic dance. To a species that lived in a perpetual hurricane, the lack of air resistance felt like being buried alive in invisible concrete. Aris watched them, a strange, hollow sense of clarity settling over her. She recognized this. This was the paralysis of the overspecialized. They were Ferraris in a world that had suddenly turned into a muddy swamp. They were perfect machines designed for one specific, extreme environment. And now that the environment was gone, they were pieces of expensive scrap metal. Administrator Kalik was a shivering mess of violet light in the corner. His translucent skin was flickering like a dying neon sign. "The backup generators," he stammered, his voice thin and reedy without the acoustic amplification of the station's main computer. "They are not engaging. The entropy parasites. They have anchored themselves to the primary conduits. They are not just eating the power, they are rewriting the physical laws of the distribution nodes." Aris walked over to him, her boots crunching on a stray piece of Ilara's dropped chocolate. "Kalik, look at me. How many minutes of atmospheric integrity do we have left in the central hub?" The administrator's eyes darted around, unable to focus. 20, maybe 25 minutes. After that, the carbon dioxide scrubbers will saturate. The heat will bleed into the void. "We are going to become a cold tomb, Dr. Thorne. The lithoderms will shatter. The Gale Stalkers will suffocate." Aris looked at her brother and sister. Jax was already checking the seals on his phase shift suit, his movements crisp and devoid of panic. Ilara was salvaged her backpack, checking the charge on her handheld scanner. They weren't paralyzed. They were busy. "We grew up in a house where the roof leaked every time it rained, and the heater broke every winter," Aris thought, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "We spent 10 years on the Mars Alpha colony, where the air recyclers failed so often we learned to hold our breaths in our sleep. This isn't an apocalypse to us. It is just another Tuesday in the Crucible." She turned back to the room, raising her voice. "Listen up, everyone. If you can hear me, stay calm, or at least stay still. You are all dying because you are waiting for the station to fix itself. It isn't going to happen." The lithoderm, Crag Hewer, turned his head slowly, the movement accompanied by a dry, rasping sound. "You, soft skin, what can you do? Your body is a bag of fragile fluids. You will freeze before I do." "Maybe," Aris said, her voice cutting through the gloom. "But I know how to use a thermal blanket, and I know how to bypass a dead circuit with a piece of copper wire. My species spent 5,000 years living in caves and tents before we figured out how to build a world that didn't try to kill us every morning. We are the masters of the jury rig," she pointed to Jax. "This is Commander Vance. He is a Void Marine. He is going to lead a team to the secondary engineering deck. We are going to find a way to jumpstart the life support for your pods manually." The Gale Stalker, Swift Wind, pressed his snout against the glass. "The air is dead, human. There is no movement. I cannot think. I cannot breathe." Ilara stepped forward, holding up a small, handheld fan she had pulled from her bag. It was a cheap plastic thing, probably a souvenir from a port on Ceres. She clicked it on, and the whirring blades created a tiny, pathetic puff of air. It isn't a hurricane-swift wind, but it is a breeze. If you come out of that tank and stay close to us, we will keep the air moving. We will keep you upright. The absurdity of it was almost poetic. The most dangerous predator of the wind tunnels was being offered salvation by a $5 plastic fan. Swiftwind hesitated, his whiskers twitching. The air outside, it is thin. It is better than no air at all, Jax barked, his voice echoing in the chamber. Now, either you stay in there and become a very expensive statue, or you come out here and help us save this bucket. Choose now. We are on the clock. One by one, the Deathworlders began to move. They moved with a ginger, uncertain grace, like giants who had suddenly realized they were walking on thin ice. The lithoderms wrapped themselves in emergency thermal tarps provided by the station's lockers, looking like massive, silver-wrapped baked potatoes. The gale stalkers huddled together, their limbs intertwined to provide stability in the absence of wind. As they followed Jax toward the heavy blast doors of Sector 7, Aris felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the failing heaters. She looked at the shadows dancing on the bone-white walls of the corridor. The entropy scourge wasn't just a threat from the outside. It was a reminder that the universe was always trying to return to a state of cold, dark equilibrium. We are the only things in this galaxy that don't belong, she thought. Everything else was designed for a place. We were designed for the struggle. The doors hissed open, revealing a long, darkened tunnel that led toward the heart of the station. The air here was already colder, the smell of ozone replaced by a strange metallic scent that made Aris's teeth ache. It was the smell of the scourge. It was the smell of life being unmade. Aris tightened the straps of her breather mask. She looked at her sister, who was trying to calibrate the scanner in the dark, and her brother, whose hand was steady on his weapon. There were 3 humans and a dozen of the most dangerous beings in the cosmos, and for the first time in her life, Aris Thorne felt like they were the ones who were truly in control. "Let's move," she whispered to the darkness. "We have work to do." The walk through the primary transit spine of the ossuary felt like descending into the belly of a dying beast. Every few meters, a spark would shower down from the ceiling as the station's nervous system short-circuited. The walls, once a pristine, clinical white, were now streaked with a dark, iridescent film that pulsed with a faint, sickly light. "Dr. Thorne," Ilara whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the emergency fans. "Look at the film. It isn't just a coating. It is eating the molecular bonds of the ceramic. The entropy is literal. It is breaking down the complex polymers into simple carbon chains." Aris nodded, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. "It is a digestive system, Ilara. The scourge doesn't destroy. It consumes potential energy. It turns order into chaos." They reached a junction where the gravity plating had failed. A 50-meter stretch of corridor was now a zero-gravity zone, filled with floating debris and frozen droplets of hydraulic fluid. For the lithoderms, this was a nightmare. They were built for 4 gravities. In 0G, their massive bodies were clumsy, dangerous projectiles. Crag Hewer began to drift, his limbs flailing. I am falling," he roared, the grinding of his voice filled with a primal terror that shook Aris to her core. "There is no floor. There is no ground." Jax didn't hesitate. He kicked off from a wall, his boots clanging against the metal as he intercepted the obsidian giant. He fired his suit's localized thrusters, stabilizing the 3-ton alien with a grunt of effort. "Relax, Hewer. You are not falling. You are just floating. Use your mass." Jax grabbed a length of emergency cable from his belt and tethered it to the lithoderm's shoulder plate. Then he tossed the other end to Ilara, who secured it to a structural rib of the corridor. "We are going to leapfrog. One at a time. Humans go first to set the lines. You big guys just hold on and pull." As Aris watched her brother work, she saw the shift in the aliens' eyes. They were watching a creature that was physically insignificant compared to them. A creature whose bones would snap under a fraction of their strength, moving with a confidence they couldn't fathom. Jax wasn't just surviving, he was improvising. He was treating the failure of gravity as a tactical challenge rather than a cosmic tragedy. We are the species that invented the ladder because we couldn't fly, Aris thought. We invented the boat because we couldn't breathe underwater. Every limitation we have has been a prompt for an invention. They made it across the zero-gravity zone, but the effort had cost them precious minutes. The air was getting thicker, a heavy, wet heat beginning to rise as the cooling systems for the lithoderm habitat bled into the main corridor. Aris checked her watch. 15 minutes since the blackout. We need to reach the manual override for the atmospheric scrubbers in Sector 9, she said, her voice sounding muffled through her breather. If we don't get the air moving, the Gale Stalkers are going to go into cardiac arrest. Swift Wind, the Gale Stalker, was leaning heavily against the wall, his sensory whiskers drooping. The silence, he hissed. It is like a weight on my brain. I cannot hear the world. Ilare walked over to him and did something Aris hadn't expected. She took off her own breather mask for a moment, exposing herself to the thinning, toxic air, and blew a sharp, sudden breath directly into the alien's facial pits. Swift Wind flinched, his eyes snapping open. There, Alara said, coughing slightly as she refitted her mask. That's a movement. That's a change. Focus on the sound of my voice. It is a vibration. It is a tiny storm. Keep moving, Swift Wind. That's an order from a human. The Gale Stalker straightened his spine, a new spark of defiance in his eyes. You are very strange, little human. You treat death like an annoying neighbor. Aris felt a surge of warmth in her chest despite the freezing air. That's because he is Swift Wind, and on our world, we don't invite neighbors in unless they bring beer. They reached the doors to Sector 9, but they were fused shut. The iridescent film of the scourge had pulled in the seams, hardening into a crystalline structure that was stronger than the steel it had replaced. Jack stepped forward, examining the obstruction. "Foobar," he muttered, the old military slang slipping out naturally. "This isn't just a lock, it's a weld. We are not getting through here with a crowbar." He looked at Craig Hewer. "Hewer, I need you to listen. I know you are cold, I know your joints are stiffening, but I need all that Category 10 strength right now. I am going to set a localized charge on the hinges to weaken them. When it blows, I need you to hit this door like it owes you money." The lithoderm leaned forward, his gray skin beginning to show cracks. I do not know if I have the heat." "I'll give you the heat," Alara said, stepping forward with 2 chemical flares. She cracked them open, the brilliant orange light illuminating the dark corridor with a harsh, flickering glow. She pressed the flares against the lithoderm's chest plates. "It is a temporary chemical reaction, but it will kickstart your core temperature for 60 seconds. Use it." Craig Hewer roared, the sound no longer one of terror, but of a rekindled volcanic fury. The orange light reflected off his obsidian skin as he braced himself against the wall. Jack set the charges. 3, 2, 1, bug out! The explosion was small, contained, but enough to shatter the crystalline entropy film. Before the echoes had even died away, Craig Hewer lunged. 3 tons of silicon and rage slammed into the fused door. The metal groaned, screamed, and then buckled inward with a sound like a thunderclap. The way was open, but as they stepped into Sector 9, Aris realized that the struggle had only just begun. The room was not empty. Huddled in the corner, surrounded by the pulsing, iridescent shadows of the scourge, were a dozen members of the station's civilian staff. They were huddled together, waiting for the end. And standing between them and the rescue team were the first of the scourge constructs. They were spindly, multi-jointed things made of the same iridescent film, shadows given physical form, their limbs ending in long, crystalline needles. Jax raised his pistol, his thumb flicking the safety off. "Check your 6, everyone," he growled, his voice dropping into a combat register. "The party is just getting started." Aris looked at the terrified civilians and then at the obsidian giant and the storm hunter standing beside her. "We didn't come here to be observers," she thought, her hand reaching for a heavy metal pipe on the floor. "We came here to be the ones who didn't quit." Commander Jax Vance did not believe in miracles. He believed in kinetic energy, structural integrity, and the fact that most problems could be solved if you hit them hard enough with the right tool. As he stood in the doorway of Sector 9, watching the scourge constructs twitch in the flickering light of Alara's flares, he felt a familiar cold electricity humming through his cybernetic arm. "Sit rep," he barked, his voice cutting through the whimpering of the trapped station staff. "Aris, get those civilians to the back of the room. Alara, find the manual scrubber override. I'll keep the bug eyes busy." One of the scourge constructs lunged, its movement a blur of impossible geometry. It didn't run so much as it folded through space, appearing 5 meters closer in the blink of an eye. Jax didn't wait. He leveled his kinetic pistol and fired 2 rounds. The heavy slugs, forged from depleted uranium, slammed into the construct's chest. There was no blood. The thing simply shattered into a cloud of iridescent dust, only to begin reforming almost instantly. "They are self-repairing," Alara shouted, her fingers flying over a dead terminal as she tried to bypass the security lock. "The entropy film is using the station's ambient heat to reknit the bonds." "Then we take away the heat," Jax yelled back. He holstered his pistol and drew a vibro blade, the edge humming at a frequency that could sever molecular chains. "Crag Hewer, swift wind. Don't let them surround us. Use the furniture." The room was a chaos of shadows and screaming metal. Crag Hewer, still fueled by the chemical heat of Alara's flares, was a whirlwind of obsidian destruction. He grabbed a massive metal desk and used it as a club, smashing 2 of the constructs into the floor with a sound like breaking glass. Swift Wind moved like a ghost, his multi-limbed body twisting through the air, his talons shredding the iridescent film before the constructs could stabilize. But for everyone they knocked down, 2 more seemed to seep out of the walls. The scourge wasn't an army, it was an infection. Jax felt a sharp sting in his shoulder as a crystalline needle grazed his suit. The HUD on his visor flashed amber. "Warning, corrosive agent detected. Suit integrity at 92%. He cursed, spinning around to kick a construct back. He felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were in a room with no air, limited light, and an enemy that didn't know how to stay dead. On any other world, this would be the point where the mission was scrubbed and the team retreated. But humans don't have a hard deck for retreat when there are people behind them. Aris was in the back of the room, her arm around a terrified Altarian child. She was talking to them, her voice calm and steady, despite the monsters only 10 meters away. "It is going to be okay," she was saying. "My brother is very good at breaking things. We have a saying on Earth, if it has a face, we can punch it. If it doesn't have a face, we'll find where the face should be." Jax grinned in the dark. That was a lie, of course. They didn't have a saying like that. But Aris was always good at the psychological grift. "Commander," Alara's voice was strained, "I have the override, but I need a massive power jolt to clear the entropy film from the intake vents. My battery packs aren't enough." Jax looked at the room. He looked at the lithoderms, whose internal batteries were nearly drained. He looked at the Gale stalkers, who were stumbling from hypoxia. Then he looked at his own left arm. The cybernetic limb was powered by a high-density fusion cell, a piece of black market tech that was designed to last for 20 years of combat. It was wired directly into his nervous system. "Alara," he shouted, dodging a swipe from a construct. "Can you use a direct feed from my arm?" The room went silent for a heartbeat, the only sound the rasping breath of the aliens. "Jax, no," Aris said, her voice sharp with alarm. "That cell is integrated. If you dump the charge, the feedback could fry your heart. It could leave you paralyzed." Jax looked at the constructs, which were beginning to overwhelm Crag Hewer. The obsidian giant was slowing down, the gray cracks on his skin widening. Swift Wind was on his knees, gasping for air that wasn't there. "Better paralyzed than dead," Jax growled. "Alara, do it! That's an order!" Alara didn't argue. She knew that tone. She scrambled over to him, pulling a jumper cable from her kit. She looked at her brother's eyes, her own filled with a mixture of terror and pride. "Hold on, Jax. This is going to suck." She jammed the cable into the maintenance port on his elbow. Jax Vance had been shot, stabbed, and once blown through a vacuum seal, but nothing prepared him for the sensation of his own life force being sucked out through his arm. The world turned into a screaming white void. Every nerve in his body felt like it was being scorched by a blowtorch. His vision blurred, and he felt his knees buckle. but his cybernetic hand gripped the cable with the strength of a dying star. The power surged through the line, a brilliant blue arc of pure energy that slammed into the station's terminal. For a second, the entire Sector 9 groaned. Then, with a sound like a giant taking a deep breath, the vents overhead roared to life. The air didn't just return, it exploded into the room. A massive blast of recycled, scrubbed oxygen hammered the Galestalkers, who stood up as if they had been struck by lightning. The sudden change in pressure and the surge of electrical energy hit the scourge constructs like a physical wave. The iridescent film began to boil, the entropy bonds breaking apart under the sudden return of order and energy. Jax fell to the floor, his left arm smoking, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. He couldn't feel his legs. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. But he could hear the wind. Swift wind let out a shriek of pure, predatory joy. He didn't just move, he became a blur of silver and teeth. With the air pressure back to normal, his species was once again the apex predator of the galaxy. He tore through the remaining constructs like they were made of wet paper. Crag Hewer, sensing the return of the station's heat, stood up and began to systematically pulverize the crystalline remains into dust. In 5 minutes, the room was clear. Aris ran to Jax's side, her hands trembling as she checked his vitals. "Jax! Talk to me, you idiot!" Jax blinked, his vision slowly returning. His left arm was a dead weight, the metal casing scorched black. He looked up at his sister and managed a weak, lopsided grin. Did it work?" "It worked," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "The scrubbers are at 100%. The life support for the whole sector is back online." Craig Hewer approached them, his massive obsidian body radiating a warmth that felt like a furnace. He looked down at the fallen human, his faceted eyes glowing with a new profound light. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he slowly knelt, a gesture of submission that no lithoderm had ever shown to another species. "You are not prey," the giant rumbled, the sound vibrating through the floor and into Jax's bones. "You are not soft. You are the fire that burns in the cold. You are the stone that does not break." Jax coughed, a bit of blood staining his lip. "Yeah, well, don't tell the United Soul Defense Command. They'll want to give me a medal, and I hate parades." Swift Wind landed softly beside them, his whiskers twitching in the moving air. The Gale Stalker inclined his head toward the humans. "I heard the vibration of your heart, Commander Vance. It was small, but it was louder than the storm. You gave your own energy to save those who are not your pack. This is a strange way to live." "It's the only way we know," Aris said, helping Jax sit up. "We are a pack of 7 billion, Swift Wind. We don't have the luxury of only caring about our own." As the station's emergency crews finally arrived to take over, Aris looked around the room. She saw the lithoderms sharing their thermal blankets with the Altarians. She saw the Gale Stalkers helping the station staff move debris. The barriers were gone. The glass enclosures were broken, but for the first time, the people inside them were truly connecting. This was the lesson of the crucible, she realized. It wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being the bridge. It was about finding the one thing that connects the fire to the ice and holding on to it until the world makes sense again. But as she looked at her brother's blackened arm and the exhaustion in Alara's eyes, Aris knew that the scourge was still out there. This was just one room, one sector, in a station that was still being eaten from the inside out. "Jax," she whispered, "can you move?" Jax Vance looked at his dead arm, then at the giants standing around him, waiting for his next command. He took a deep breath of the scrubbed metallic air and forced himself to stand. It took every ounce of his stubborn, human will, but he stood. "I'm Oscar Mike, Aris," he said, using the military code for being on the move. "We have a station to save, and I think I just found a few more recruits for the team." He looked at Crag, Hewer, and Swiftwind. "You guys ready to show these entropy bastards how a Deathworlder says hello?" Crag Hewer slammed his stony fists together, a sound like a mountain collapsing. "Lead the way, human." The unlikely squad moved out of Sector 9, heading toward the heart of the Ossuary. They were a mess of cracked stone, frayed whiskers, and broken electronics, led by a man who couldn't feel his left side. They were the galaxy's most dangerous mistakes, and for the first time in history, they were marching in step. And in the darkness of the transit tunnels, the scourge began to feel something it had never experienced in all its eons of consumption. It felt resistance. Aris Thorne walked at the back of the group, her eyes fixed on the flickering lights ahead. She thought about the millions of years of evolution that had led to this moment. She thought about the 5 mass extinctions humanity's world had survived. We are not just survivors, she thought. We are the ones who remember how to build the world again after it ends. The real summit was only just beginning. The heart of the ossuary was not a room, but a cathedral of dying light. As the group limped into the primary reactor chamber, the scale of the disaster finally became undeniable. The central core, a massive pillar of contained exotic matter that usually glowed with a steady, comforting violet, was now choked by a pulsating web of iridescent black veins. The entropy scourge had not just breached the hull, it had rooted itself into the station's very soul. Commander Jax Vance leaned against a bulkhead, his left arm hanging uselessly at his side like a piece of dead meat. His face was a mask of sweat and grit, his breathing a shallow, rhythmic rasp. Every few seconds, his cybernetic hand would twitch with a stray electrical arc, a reminder of the price he had paid in Sector 9. "Status, Ilara," Jax grunted, his voice sounding like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Give me the straight talk. How bad is the plumbing?" Ilara Vance was already at the main diagnostic altar, her fingers dancing across a haptic interface that was half frozen in crystalline entropy film. "It's a total cluster, Jax. The scourge has created a parasitic feedback loop. It is pulling energy from the core to harden its own structure, which in turn chokes the core further. If we don't clear the main conduits in the next 45 minutes, the containment field will collapse." "And if the field collapses?" Aris Thorne asked, stepping up beside her sister. "Then we stop being a station and start being a localized supernova," Ilara said, not looking up. "We'll be a bright spot in the sky for about 3 seconds before we are deleted from the census." The survivors from Sector 9 were huddled in the center of the chamber, a motley collection of species that looked like they had been dragged through a thresher. The lithoderms were shivering, their obsidian hides covered in a fine layer of white frost. The gale stalkers were hunched over, their hollow bones rattling with every tremor of the station. Administrator Kalik was fluttering around the edges of the room, his skin a sickly, mottled gray. "We must prioritize the thermal stabilizers," he chirped, his translator sounding desperate. "If the heat drops another 10 degrees, the lithoderms will enter a state of irreversible cryofracture. They will literally shatter from the inside out." "No!" Swiftwind snapped, his voice a series of sharp, angry barks. "We need the kinetic recirculators. Without air movement, my people are suffocating. Our lungs cannot pump stagnant air. We are already blacking out." The tension in the room spiked instantly. It was a classic Deathworlder standoff. On their own planets, these species never had to share. They were the masters of their domains, the apex predators of their specific hells. Now trapped in a failing tin can, they were looking at each other not as allies, but as competitors for a dwindling pile of life. Crag Hewer stepped forward, his massive stony feet cracking the crystalline film on the floor. He loomed over the smaller gale stalker, his glowing eyes narrowed to slits of molten orange. "You want us to freeze so you can have a breeze, little bird? My people have endured the pressure of 4 gravities for 1,000,000 years. We will not end as dust in a cold room." "Your people are statues," Swiftwind hissed, his talons clicking against the deck plates. "You contribute nothing to the hunt. If we do not have air, we cannot fight the scourge. Your strength is useless if you are too cold to move." Aris felt the humanistic theme she had preached in the dining hall beginning to fray. It was easy to talk about cooperation when the coffee was hot and the lights were on. It was a different thing entirely when the choice was between your own survival and the life of the being standing next to you. "Stow it!" Jax roared, the effort causing him to wince as a fresh wave of pain rolled over him. "Both of you. You are acting like kids fighting over the last ration pack." Crag Hewer turned his mountain of a head toward Jax. "This is not a game, human. This is the law of the Forge. Only the strongest survive the winter." Aris stepped between the two giants. She looked small, almost insignificant, between the obsidian colossus and the feathered predator, but her gaze was as cold as the void outside. "You are wrong, Hewer. That isn't the law of the forge. That's the law of the loser." The room went quiet. Even the scourge seemed to pulse more slowly for a heartbeat. "My world didn't just have one winter," Aris said, her voice carrying a weight of ancestral memory. "It had hundreds. We call them ice ages. During the Great Frost of the year 2088, my ancestors were trapped in the underground bunkers of the Himalayan ridge. They had enough power to run the heaters for the nursery or the oxygen scrubblers for the entire colony. Not both." Crag Hewer leaned in, his breath smelling of hot ozone. "And what did they choose?" "They didn't choose," Aris said. "They compromised. They moved everyone into the nursery. They used the body heat of the adults to keep the children warm, and they used the oxygen scrubbers on a 50% duty cycle. Everyone was cold. Everyone was lightheaded. Everyone was miserable. But when the sun came up 6 months later, everyone was alive." She looked at Swiftwind, then back to the lithoderm. "You want to survive? Then you have to accept that you are going to be uncomfortable. Alara, can we cross-link the thermal grid and the kinetic fans?" Alara bit her lip, checking the schematics. "It's risky. I can shunt the waste heat from the reactor core directly into the air ducts. It will keep the lithoderms above the fracture point, but the air will be thin and hot. The gale stalkers will have to deal with low pressure, and the lithoderms will have to deal with a constant, irritating draft." "It will be a hell for everyone," Aris summarized. Crag Hewer looked at Swiftwind. The gale stalker looked at the obsidian giant. For a long minute, the only sound was the crackling of the scourge on the walls. "A hell we share," Swiftwind whispered, his whiskers twitching. "Or a grave we occupy alone." "Do it, Alara," Crag Hewer rumbled. As Alara began the bypass, Aris felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. A sudden, violent tremor rocked the station, throwing everyone to the floor. A section of the ceiling in the reactor chamber buckled, and a massive, pulsating mass of iridescent scourge matter dropped into the room. It wasn't a construct this time. It was a primary node, a gargantuan, many-tentacled heart of entropy that began to pulse with a blinding, sickly light. "It's blocking the manual purge valve," Alara screamed over the sound of the grinding metal. "If we don't clear that node, I can't reset the containment field." Jax tried to stand, but his legs gave out. His face was white. "Aris, I'm zeroed out. My arm is ghosting my whole nervous system. I can't lead this one." Aris looked at the node, then at the two deathworlders who were now shivering in the hot, thin air Alara had provided. She saw the fear in their eyes, a fear of a threat they couldn't simply overpower or outrun. "Hewer, Swiftwind," Aris said, grabbing her heavy metal pipe. "My brother is down. I am a sociologist with a bad hip and a flashlight. Alara is a gearhead with a tablet. If that thing isn't cleared, we all die." Swiftwind stood up, his limbs shaky but his talons extended. "The air is foul, human. It smells of burnt copper in your own sweat. It is the worst wind I have ever felt." He looked at Crag Hewer and offered a multi-jointed limb. "Shall we go for a walk in the breeze, Stone Brother?" Crag Hewer took the limb, his obsidian hand dwarfing the Galestalker's arm. "For the hunt, Wind Brother." Aris watched them charge the scourge node, a creature of stone and a creature of air fighting side by side in a hot, suffocating room. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen, but as she turned to help Alara, she noticed something that made her heart stop. The iridescent film wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was creeping across the floor toward the unconscious survivors, and it was moving with a purposeful, terrifying intelligence. The scourge wasn't just trying to eat the station, it was trying to erase them. Aris gripped her pipe and stepped into the path of the advancing film. "We are the bridge," she whispered to herself. "And the bridge does not break." The maintenance ducts of Sector 12 were never meant for biological life. They were a cramped, jagged labyrinth of fiber optic bundles, coolant pipes, and high-voltage rails designed for the scuttling repair drones of the Ossuary. Now they were the only path left for the humans and their wounded allies. 300 meters, Jax whispered, his voice a ghost of its former self. His left side was completely dead now. The cybernetic arm a leaden weight that Aris and Alara had to help him drag through the narrow tunnels. 300 meters to the auxiliary control hub. If we can reach it, we can vent the reactor room and flush the scourge into the void. They had left Crag Hewer and Swiftwind behind to hold the reactor chamber. It had been a choice that tore at Aris's soul, but the Deathworlders were the only ones strong enough to keep the primary scourge node from crushing the core. "Go, little human," Crag Hewer had rumbled as the door hissed shut. "We will be the anvil. You be the hammer." Now the hammer was struggling to crawl through a pipe that felt like it was shrinking every minute. The air in the ducts was thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the bitter, metallic tang of the scourge. Alara was in the lead, her handheld scanner casting a flickering blue light on the walls. "The entropy film is ghosting our signatures, Aris. It's like the station is trying to forget we exist. Every time I scan the path ahead, the geometry of the tunnel seems to shift." "It's not the station," Aris said, her hands raw from pulling Jax's weight. "It's the scourge. It's a literal manifestation of disorder. It doesn't want us to find our way, because a path is a form of order." A sudden, skittering sound echoed from the darkness behind them. It wasn't the heavy footfalls of a construct. It was something smaller, faster. A dozen tiny needle-limbed shadows were flowing through the ducts like a liquid. "Check 6, Jax barked, his eyes snapping open. He tried to reach for his pistol with his right hand, but his coordination was shot. His fingers fumbled with the holster. "Damn it! I'm a flatline, Aris! I can't get the piece out!" Aris didn't hesitate. She scrambled over her brother, her boots kicking against the narrow walls. "Give it to me, Jax." "You don't know how to use a Mark IV kinetic," Jax gasped. "I know how to point and pull," Aris snapped. She yanked the heavy weapon from his holster. The weight of it was surprising, a cold, solid piece of human engineering in a world of alien ghosts. She turned toward the darkness just as the first of the needle shadows lunged. She didn't think. She didn't aim with the precision of a soldier. She just fired. The recoil of the heavy slugs nearly dislocated her shoulder, the boom of the discharge deafening in the confined space. The muzzle flash illuminated the tunnel for a fraction of a second, revealing a swarm of iridescent things with too many legs and no faces. The first two shattered into dust. The others retreated into the shadows, clicking and chirping in a language of pure static. "Nice shot, Doc," Jax whispered, his eyes filled with a pained pride. "Now keep moving. They're just ghosting us. They want to see how long we can run." They continued their agonizing crawl. Minutes bled into hours, or maybe it was only seconds. In the sensory-deprived environment of the ducts, time had lost its meaning. Aris's muscles were screaming, her joints felt like they were filled with hot sand, and her lungs burned with every breath. This was the persistence hunt that Swiftwind had spoken of. But they weren't the hunters. They were the prey being outlasted by a force that never got tired, never got hungry, and never felt pain. Aris felt a wave of despair wash over her. What was the point? Even if they reached the control hub, even if they saved the station, what was left for humanity in a galaxy where the very laws of physics were being eaten by an ancient hunger? We were just observers, she thought. We were never supposed to be the heroes. She stopped, her head drooping against the cold metal of a coolant pipe. "Aris," Ilara's voice was filled with fear. "Aris, don't stop. We're almost there. I can see the junction for Sector 12. "I can't, Ilara," Aris whispered. "I'm not a void marine. I'm not a deathworlder. I'm just a woman who reads books about dead civilizations. I don't have the grit for this." A heavy, calloused hand grabbed her wrist. It was Jax. His grip was weak, but his eyes were burning with a fierce, terminal intensity. "Listen to me, Aris," Jax growled. "You remember when we were kids on the Mars colony? The time the oxygen scrubbers failed in the middle of the night, and Dad had to carry us 5 miles through the tunnels to the emergency airlock?" Aris nodded, tears stinging her eyes. "He didn't have a suit," Jax said. "He was breathing the same thin, CO2 heavy crap we were. He was coughing up blood by the time we got there. I asked him later how he did it, how he kept walking when his lungs were on fire." Jax leaned in, his forehead touching hers. "He told me he didn't think about the 5 miles. He just thought about the next 6 inches. One hand, then the other, one crawl, then the next. He told me that humans aren't the strongest because we can run a marathon. We are the strongest because we can survive 1 billion 6-inch struggles in a row. Jax let go of her wrist and gestured to the tunnel ahead. 6 inches, Aris. That's all I'm asking for. Just the next 6 inches. Aris looked at her brother, then at her sister, who was waiting in the flickering blue light. She felt a spark of something old and stubborn ignite in her chest. It wasn't hope. It wasn't courage. It was just a refusal to let the darkness have the last word. She gripped the handle of the kinetic pistol and pulled Jax forward. 6 inches, she whispered. They reached the junction 10 minutes later. The control hub was a small circular room filled with ancient analog switches and heavy manual levers, a design choice made by the original station architects to ensure that even a total computer failure wouldn't leave the station helpless. Ilara scrambled to the primary console. I have to cycle the airlocks in the reactor chamber manually. It's going to take 300 kilograms of force to throw the main lever. Aris looked at the lever. It was a massive iron bar, coated in the iridescent film of the scourge. She tried to pull it, but it didn't budge. It was like trying to move a mountain. Ilara joined her, both of them pulling with everything they had. The metal groaned, but the scourge film held it fast. It was hardening, turning into a crystalline lock. We need more mass, Ilara cried. Jax was on the floor watching them. He looked at his paralyzed left arm, the blackened metal and the fried circuitry. He looked at the heavy power cable hanging from the wall, the one that fed the hub's emergency lighting. Ilara, he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. Strip the casing off that cable. Jax, no! Ilara screamed, realizing what he was thinking. You already dumped your cell. If you take a direct hit from the station's emergency bus, you'll be toasted. Do it, Jax roared. I'm already half toasted anyway. If we don't throw that lever, Hewer and Swiftwind are dead. Everyone is dead. Ilara's hands were shaking as she stripped the cable. She looked at Aris, seeking a reason to stop, but Aris only nodded slowly. The lesson of the day was sacrifice. The lesson was that the bridge is built with the bodies of those who refuse to let it fall. Ilara pressed the live cable against Jax's cybernetic arm. The surge was biblical. A gout of blue flame erupted from Jax's shoulder, the smell of ozone and burning meat filling the tiny room. Jax's body arched, his mouth open in a silent scream, but the electrical current forced his dead cybernetic hand to snap shut. It clamped onto the manual lever with the strength of a hydraulic press. Now! Jax gasped through clenched teeth. Pull with me! Aris and Ilara grabbed the lever, their hands over Jax's smoking metal fingers. They pulled. They pulled for the humans on Earth. They pulled for the lithoderms in the frost. They pulled for the Gale stalkers in the silence. With a sound like a world breaking in half, the lever slammed home. Far below in the reactor chamber, the massive airlocks cycled open. A deafening roar filled the station as the atmosphere was sucked into the vacuum of space, taking the scourge node and the iridescent film with it. The containment field flickered, turned violet once more, and stabilized. The lights in the control hub flickered to a steady, warm white. Jax slumped forward, the cable falling from his arm. He was breathing but barely. His left side was a ruin of melted plastic and scorched flesh. Aris fell to her knees, pulling her brother into her lap. Jax? Jax, stay with me. We did it. The air is back. The core is safe. Jax's eyes fluttered open. He looked at the ceiling, then at his sisters. Is it quiet? Yes, Jax, Aris whispered, stroking his hair. It's quiet. Good, he said, his voice fading to a whisper. I always hated that alarm. He closed his eyes. Ilara was already on her knees, her medical kit open, her hands moving with a frantic, desperate speed. He's in shock, Aris. I need to stabilize the neural feedback. Help me. As Aris worked to save her brother, she heard a sound from the hallway. A heavy, rhythmic thudding. The door to the hub slid open, and Crag Hewer stepped inside. He was covered in scars, his obsidian hide pitted and cracked, but he was standing. He was carrying Swiftwind in his arms, the Gale stalker looking battered but conscious. The giant looked at the 3 humans huddled on the floor. He looked at the smoking wreck of Jax's arm and the blood on Aris's hands. He didn't speak. He simply walked over and sat down on the floor next to them, his massive body providing a wall of heat for the shivering humans. Swift Wind curled up in the crook of the giant's arm, his whiskers twitching as he watched the humans work. The silence was no longer a wait, it was a shared space. "We are a strange pack," Swift Wind whispered, his voice weak but clear. "One made of stone, one of air, and three of— What did you call it, Aris?" "Grit," Aris said, her eyes fixed on her brother's pale face. "We are made of grit," Craig Hewer nodded, his glowing eyes reflecting the warm light of the station. "Then let the galaxy be warned," he rumbled. The scourge thought it was hunting individuals. It did not realize it was hunting a bridge. Aris looked at the two Deathworlders, then at her sister, then at the man who had given his own nerves to buy them 6 more inches of life. She realized then that the summit hadn't been a failure. It had been the most successful diplomatic mission in human history. They hadn't just survived the scourge. They had invented a new way to live. But as the station's internal sensors began to chime, announcing the arrival of the Coalition's heavy rescue fleet, Aris knew that the war was far from over. The scourge was a tide, and they were only a few rocks on the shore. "We're going to need more grit," she thought. A lot more. The arrival of the High Convergence fleet was not the triumphant herald of salvation that Aris Thorne had envisioned during her long hours in the dark. Instead, it was a sterile, clinical intrusion. 3 massive dreadnoughts, their hulls shimmering with a perfect, unblemished gold, settled into a defensive formation around the battered skeleton of the Ossuary. They looked like gods descending into a slaughterhouse, their presence casting long, arrogant shadows over the blood and obsidian dust that coated the station's interior. Aris stood in the primary docking bay, her hands shoved deep into the pockets of a borrowed oversized flight jacket. Her knuckles were still bruised, and her hair was a matted nest of sweat and carbon scoring. Beside her, Craig Hewer remained a silent mountain of cracked stone, his glowing eyes fixed on the descending shuttle of the High Commander. Swift Wind paced in tight, agitated circles behind them, his talons clicking rhythmically against the metal floor. They looked like a nightmare. They looked like the very things the Coalition had spent centuries trying to ignore. The shuttle doors hissed open, and out stepped High Commander Valen. He was a member of the Sylph race, ethereal, long-limbed, and virtually translucent. His species had evolved on a world where the gravity was barely a whisper, and the air was a constant, fragrant mist. To Valen, the air in the docking bay was probably a toxic sludge of human sweat and lithoderm ozone. He didn't walk so much as he glided, flanked by 6 armored guards whose weapons were pointed not at the shadows, but at the survivors. Administrator Kalik was there to meet him, his skin flashing a frantic, submissive shade of yellow. "High Commander, thank the stars you have arrived. The situation, it is unprecedented." The entropy levels, Valen held up a slender, 4-fingered hand, silencing the administrator. "I have seen the telemetry, Kalik. The ossuary has been compromised. The scourge has rooted itself into the primary core. According to Protocol 4-7, this station is to be declared a total loss and sterilized immediately." Aris felt the air leave her lungs as if she had been punched. "Sterilized? High Commander, there are over 400 survivors on this station. We just saved the reactor." Valen turned his gaze toward her, his eyes like polished pearls, devoid of any warmth. "And you are the human, Dr. Thorne, the sociology observer. I have read your reports. Or rather, I have read the reports of your unorthodox methods." He glanced at Craig Hewer and Swift Wind with a look of profound distaste. "You have breached the bioquarantine protocols of 5 different sectors. You have allowed Deathworld species to intermingle their environmental waste. The contamination level in Sector 9 is so high that our sensors cannot even identify the air as breathable. You haven't saved the station, Doctor. You have turned it into a petri dish for chaos." Craig Hewer let out a low, vibrating growl that made the Sylph guards shift their weight. "We bled for that room, Shiny One. We held the core when your automated systems tucked tail and ran." Valen didn't even flinch. "That is exactly the problem. Your species are built for violence and endurance. You are reactive. The scourge is a logic plague as much as it is a biological one. By fighting it with raw force, you have only encouraged it to adapt to more aggressive forms. My scientists believe the only way to stop the spread to the rest of the sector is to collapse the Lagrange point and vent the entire area with high-frequency gamma bursts. Aris stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't have Jax's gun or Hewer's strength, but she had spent her life studying how civilizations lived and died. You're making a mistake, Valen. A massive, arrogant mistake. You think you can solve a forest fire with a scalpel. You think order is the only weapon against entropy. Is it not? Valen asked, his voice smooth and cold. No, Aris snapped. Entropy is the heat death of the universe. It is the ultimate end of everything. You can't out-order it. You can only outlive it. That's what these species do every single day. They live in places that should be impossible. They are the only ones who can stand in the middle of the scourge and not be erased because they were born in the middle of the erase. The High Commander looked at the chronometer on his wrist. The scourge hive mind, the singularity of zero, will be within striking range in exactly 52 minutes. My fleet will commence the sterilization in 40. You have 30 minutes to board the transport and leave your friends behind. Deathworlders are not permitted on Convergence dreadnoughts. Their biologies are too volatile for our life support. Swift Wind let out a sharp, barking laugh. So that is it. The soft skins run when the wind gets too loud. You leave the protectors to rot because we smell of the hunt. Valen didn't answer. He simply turned and glided back toward his shuttle. It is a calculus of survival, Dr. Thorne. I suggest you learn the math. Aris stood in the silence of the bay, watching the golden shuttle lift off. She felt a cold, hard anger crystallizing in her gut, a weight that felt heavier than the gravity of the crucible. She turned to look at Hewer and Swift Wind. They were looking at her, not with anger, but with a weary, knowing resignation. They had been told they were monsters for 1,000,000 years. This was just the final confirmation. Where is Jax? Aris asked, her voice trembling. In the medbay, Alara said, appearing from the shadows of the transit tube. She looked exhausted, her eyes red-rimmed. He's stable, but he's out of it. He keeps talking about the 6-inch struggle. Aris, what are we going to do? The coalition is going to kill us all. Aris looked at the bone-white walls of the station, then at the iridescent film that was already beginning to grow back in the corners of the bay. The scourge was coming, and the only people who knew how to fight it were being told to die quietly. We're not going anywhere, Aris said, her voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. Ilara, I need you to get into the High Commander's communication frequency. I want to talk to the whole fleet. Aris, that's treason, Ilara whispered. No, Aris said, looking at Crag Hewer. That's diplomacy, human style. She walked over to the lithoderm and placed her hand on his cold, stony arm. Hewer, you told me that humans were the bridge. Well, a bridge is only useful if it's anchored on both sides. I'm going to need you to be the anchor. I'm going to need all of you. Crag Hewer looked down at her, his glowing eyes reflecting the flickering emergency lights. What do you need, little bridge? I need you to show them what happens when the prey refuses to quit, Aris said. I need you to help me turn this station into the most expensive, most stubborn, most pucked-up fortress in the history of the galaxy. 10 minutes later, the voice of Dr. Aris Thorne echoed through the bridges of the 3 golden dreadnoughts. It wasn't the voice of a sociological observer. It was the voice of the crucible. Attention, High Convergence Fleet, Aris said, her voice amplified by Alara's hack signal. This is Dr. Aris Thorne of the United Soul Delegation. You have 40 minutes until you plan to murder 400 people in the name of a calculus. I am here to tell you that your math is wrong. On the bridge of the flagship, Valen looked at the view screen with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity. Doctor Thorne, you are interfering with a military operation. I'm correcting one, Aris countered. You think the scourge is a logic plague? You're right. It feeds on predictable patterns. It feeds on the perfect, golden order of your ships. But you know what it can't handle? A mess. It can't handle a species that eats poison for breakfast. It can't handle a species that lives in 4 gravities. And it definitely can't handle all of us working together. She paused, taking a deep breath of the foul, ozone-heavy air. We have established a neural bridge between the lithoderms, the Gale Stalkers, and our own technology. We are currently slaving the station's remaining defensive turrets to a decentralized, multi-species instinct. We are not a station anymore. We are a predator. And if you try to sterilize us, Aris said, her voice turning to ice, we will fight you with the same grit we used to fight the scourge. And trust me, Valen, you don't want to see what a Deathworlder looks like when he's holding a grudge. Valen stared at the screen. For the first time, the calm, translucent skin of the sylph began to flicker. You are insane. You are siding with the monsters. No, Aris said, looking at the screen with a fierce terminal pride. I'm siding with the survivors. Now you can either sit there and watch us save your sector, or you can get your golden ships out of our way. We have work to do. She cut the signal. In the medbay, Jax Vance opened his eyes. He couldn't feel his left side, and his head felt like it was being hammered by a pneumatic drill, but he could hear his sister's voice on the intercom. He saw Crag Hewer standing at the door, his massive obsidian fist glowing with a soft orange heat. Jax managed a weak, bloody grin. About time, he whispered. I was starting to think the dock was getting soft. He looked at his right hand, the one that still worked. He curled it into a fist. 6 inches, he muttered. Let's go get the next 6 inches. The station groaned as the scourge hive mind entered the system. It was a massive, shifting cloud of iridescent darkness, 5 kilometers wide, a singularity of pure entropy that seemed to swallow the light of the stars. It didn't fire weapons. It simply drifted toward the Ossuary, a wave of unmaking that was ready to erase everything in its path. But as the cloud touched the outer edges of the station's sensor range, it didn't find a sterile, dying ruin. It found a riot of noise, heat, and defiant, multicolored light. The ossuary roared. The singularity of zero did not move like a ship. It moved like an idea, a creeping thought of coldness that expanded until it touched the mind. As the iridescent cloud enveloped the ossuary, the reality within the station began to warp. The bone-white walls groaned, the molecular bonds of the ceramic screaming as the entropy wave attempted to reduce them to dust. Aris Thorne stood in the center of the bridge, her feet planted wide. She wasn't at a console. She was standing in the middle of a literal web. Ilara had spent the last 20 minutes rigging a series of neural bridge headsets, untested, dangerous prototypes, between Aris, Crag Hewer, and Swift Wind. The humanistic theme was no longer a theory. It was a physical connection. Aris felt the crushing, tectonic weight of Crag Hewer's consciousness, a slow, deep rhythm like the shifting of continents. She felt the frantic, high-velocity vibration of Swift Wind's mind, a hurricane of sensory input that threatened to tear her own thoughts apart. And in the center, she was the pivot. She was the dampener. She was the human element that translated the strength of the stone and the speed of the wind into a single defiant purpose. It was the most painful thing she had ever experienced. It felt like her brain was being pulled in 2 directions at once, her identity being eroded by the sheer scale of the alien minds. But every time she felt herself slipping, she thought of Jax. She thought of the 6-inch struggle. She thought of a species that had survived 5 mass extinctions, not by being perfect, but by being together. Hold the line, Aris roared, her voice echoing both in the room and in the minds of her allies. Hewer, give me the structural reinforcement. Swift Wind, I need the targeting vectors. In the void outside, the Coalition dreadnoughts were struggling. Their perfect shields, designed to repel lasers and kinetic slugs, were useless against the entropy wave. The golden hulls were already pitting and cracking, the crews inside descending into a state of catatonic shock as the Scourge's logic plague bypassed their sophisticated computers. But the ossuary was holding. The station was a mess of improvised defenses. Crag Hewer's people had physically braced the primary bulkheads, their silicon bodies absorbing the entropic energy and converting it into thermal heat. Swift Wind's pack was manually operating the defensive turrets, their superhuman reflexes allowing them to track the shifting shadows of the scourge in ways a computer never could. And in the heart of it all, Ilara Vance was a blur of motion. She was bypassing burned-out circuits with pieces of scrap metal, dumping the station's emergency coolant into the corridors to slow the spread of the iridescent film. She was a gearhead in her element, her face covered in grease and soot. "We're losing Sector 4, she yelled, her voice barely audible over the screaming of the station's alarms. "The atmospheric seal is bucking. Let it go." Jax's voice came over the comms. He was sitting in a modified command chair, his right hand navigating a tactical map. He looked like a corpse, but his eyes were bright with a cold, tactical fire. Seal the blast doors and vent the sector. We'll use the pressure drop to blow the scourge back into the cloud. Jax, there are people in Sector 4, Aris cried out through the neural link. Not anymore, Jax barked. I got them out 10 minutes ago. Now vent it, Alara. That's a hard deck order. The station shuddered as Sector 4 was sacrificed to the void. The sudden explosive decompression acted like a localized shock wave, clearing a path through the iridescent cloud for a fraction of a second. Now, Aris commanded, her mind reaching out to the lithoderms. Give them everything we have left. The station's primary defensive laser, a relic that hadn't been fired in 50 years, groaned to life. It wasn't a clean, focused beam of light. It was a ragged, flickering lance of energy, colored a deep, angry orange by the mineral dust the lithoderms had pumped into the focusing chamber. The beam punched into the heart of the singularity of zero. The scourge cloud recoiled. For the first time, the iridescent darkness flickered, a sound like a million dying whispers echoing through the neural bridge. The entity of entropy, a force that had erased entire star systems, was finding something it couldn't compute. It was finding a defense that was too chaotic, too gritty, and too stubborn to be unmade. It's working, Alara whispered, her eyes wide as she watched the telemetry. We're hurting it, but the cost was becoming unbearable. Aris felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her temples. Her nose began to bleed, the dark red droplets floating in the low gravity of the bridge. The neural bridge was burning out her synapses. She could feel Crag Hewer's heat beginning to scorch her mind, and Swiftwind's frantic speed was turning her thoughts into a blur of static. Aris, break the link, Jax yelled, noticing her distress. You've done enough. We can take it from here. No, Aris gasped, her hands gripping the edges of the command console. If I break the link, the coordination fails. The stone and the wind will turn on each other. We have to finish this. She closed her eyes and dove deeper into the connection. She didn't look for strength. She looked for the common ground. She looked for the moment when a lithoderm mother held her child against the cold, or a Gale Stalker pack leader shared the last of the meat with a wounded hunter. She looked for the humanistic heart that beat in every Deathworlder. She found it. It was a small, flickering light in the center of the storm, the simple, universal desire to see the sun rise one more time. She grabbed that light and shoved it into the center of the neural bridge. The result was a psychic explosion. The combined will of 3 Deathworld species, unified by a single human heart, surged through the station's communication array and into the scourge cloud. It wasn't a weapon of light or fire. It was a weapon of pure, unadulterated life. It was a shout of existence that drowned out the silence of entropy. The singularity of zero shattered. The iridescent cloud disintegrated into a million harmless specks of dust, the entropic energy dissipating into the void. The pressure on the station's hull vanished, and the bone-white walls stopped their groaning. Silence returned to the ossuary, but this time it wasn't the oily silence of death. It was the quiet of a house after a storm has passed. Aris collapsed to the floor, the neural headset sparking as it fell from her head. She couldn't feel her limbs. Her mind was a fractured mess of stone and wind, her own name feeling like a word from a forgotten language. Alara was there in an instant, cradling her head. Aris? Aris, stay with me. It's over. We won. Aris looked up at her sister, her vision blurry. Is everyone? They're alive, Aris, Alara whispered, tears streaming down her face. Hewer is standing. Swift wind is breathing. And the coalition fleet, they're just sitting there watching us. Aris turned her head slowly. Through the viewing port, she could see the 3 golden dreadnoughts. They were scarred, their hulls dull and pitted, their arrogance stripped away by the very force they had tried to ignore. They looked small. They looked fragile. Jax limped onto the bridge, his right arm around a lithoderm for support. He looked at the screen, then at his sister on the floor. Well, Doc, he said, his voice a ragged whisper, I think you just gave them a lot to think about for their next report. Aris managed a weak smile. I think I'm going to recommend a change in the syllabus, she whispered. Less calculus, more grit. As the med teams finally began to move through the station, no longer hampered by quarantine protocols or species segregation, Aris watched a lithoderm soldier help a wounded sylph pilot into a transport. She saw a Gale stalker sharing a breather mask with an Altarian technician. The bridge had been built. It was a messy, bloody, improvised thing, held together by copper wire and stubborn hope. It wasn't perfect. It was better than perfect. It was human. But as the exhaustion finally claimed her, Aris felt a lingering shadow. The scourge had been defeated here, at the Ossuary. But the galaxy was a vast, cold place, filled with 1,000 more hells and 1,000,000 more species that didn't know how to talk to each other. The 6-inch struggle was only just beginning. Aris closed her eyes, the warmth of Crag Hewer's presence a comforting weight beside her. For the first time since she had arrived at the Deathworld summit, she wasn't afraid of the darkness. She knew what was waiting in it. She knew how to find the bridge. The aftermath of a miracle is rarely beautiful. It is messy, loud, and smells of scorched insulation and antiseptic. As the primary lights of the ossuary flickered back to a steady, warm amber, the station revealed itself to be a jagged skeleton of its former clinical glory. The bone-white halls were pitted with craters where the scourge had attempted to burrow, and the air was a thick, hazy soup of recycled oxygen and powdered obsidian. Dr. Aris Thorne sat on a crate of emergency rations in the primary docking bay, her head resting in her hands. The neural bridge had left her with a headache that felt like a localized supernova behind her eyes. Every time she closed them, she could still feel the phantom weight of Crag Hewer's tectonic thoughts and the frantic, high-velocity vibration of Swiftwind's instinct. She was no longer just Aris Thorne, a sociologist from New Geneva. She was a mosaic of 3 different hells, stitched together by sheer human stubbornness. "You look like 10 miles of bad road, Doc," a voice croaked from the shadows. Aris looked up to see Commander Jax Vance being wheeled toward her on a hover gurney. He was pale, his left side draped in a sterile medical shroud, but his right hand was gripping a lukewarm cup of synthetic broth. Beside him, Ilara was walking with a noticeable limp, her face smeared with grease, but her eyes were bright with a manic, exhausted energy. "I've felt better," Aris admitted, her voice a dry rasp. "How is the arm, Jax?" Jax looked down at the empty space where his cybernetic limb had been. "The doctors say the neural feedback fried the interface ports. They'll have to dig the shrapnel out and start from scratch. It's a total foobar situation. But hey, I can still pull a trigger with my right, so I'm not exactly a write-off yet." He took a sip of the broth and winced. 6 inches, Aris. We got the next 6 inches." Aris managed a weak smile. "We got a lot more than that, Jax. Look around." The docking bay, which had once been a site of strict segregation, was now a riot of biological chaos. A group of sylph medics, their translucent skin shimmering with a pale, nervous blue, were working side by side with lithoderm engineers to stabilize a collapsed support strut. The lithoderms provided the raw, crushing strength to hold the metal in place, while the sylphs used their delicate, high-precision lasers to weld the seams. Nearby, a Gale stalker was using his multi-limb body to carry 3 wounded Altarians at once, his sensory whiskers twitching as he navigated the debris with a grace that no human or sylph could match. "The calculus has changed," Aris whispered. The sound of rhythmic, heavy footsteps echoed through the bay. High Commander Valen approached, flanked by his guards. He didn't glide with quite the same arrogance as before. His golden robes were stained with soot, and there was a noticeable crack in the ceremonial crest atop his head. He stopped 3 meters away from Aris, his pearl-like eyes scanning the scene with a profound, quiet confusion. "The singularity of zero has retreated beyond the Oort cloud of this system," Valen said, his voice no longer a cold blade, but a weary murmur. "My scientists are reporting that the entropic resonance has flatlined. You didn't just break the cloud, Dr. Thorne. You poisoned it with existence." Aris stood up slowly, her joints popping. "It wasn't poison, Valen. It was a reality check. The scourge feeds on order because order is predictable. It couldn't compute a lithoderm and a Gale stalker sharing a brain with a human. We were too noisy, too messy, Too alive. Valen looked at Crag Hewer, who was standing at the edge of the bay, watching the stars. The obsidian giant turned his head, his glowing orange eyes meeting the High Commander's gaze. There was no aggression in the look, only a deep, mountain-like patience. The High Council has issued a standing order, Valen continued, turning back to Aris. They want to quarantine the survivors. They are afraid that the neural bridge has created a permanent contamination. They want to study you, all of you, in a controlled, secure environment. Jax let out a sharp, barking laugh. Secure environment? You mean a cage, shiny one? After what we just did? Valen looked down at the floor. It is the protocol for Category 0 encounters. Aris stepped forward until she was inches away from the High Commander. She could smell the faint, floral scent of his species, mixed with the acrid stench of the station's death. Listen to me very carefully, Valen. My species has spent 500 years learning that you cannot cage a fire to keep it safe. All you do is make it burn hotter until it consumes the cage. She gestured to the room at large. These people, the lithoderms, the gale stalkers, the abyssal synapse, they aren't your subjects. They are the reason your fleet is still in one piece. They are the new front line. If you try to put them in a lab, you won't just lose their trust. You'll lose the only shield the galaxy has against the next wave. Valen's skin flickered a troubled shade of violet. And what do you propose, Dr. Thorne? I propose a new summit, Aris said, her voice gaining strength. Not at the Ossuary, not in some sterile golden palace. I propose we meet on the crucible. On Earth. Earth? Valen sounded horrified. Your world is a Class 12 Deathworld. It is a tectonic and atmospheric nightmare. Exactly, Aris said, a fierce pride in her eyes. It is the perfect neutral ground. The lithoderms will love the volcanoes. The gale stalkers will love the hurricanes. And your people will learn what it means to actually live instead of just existing in a vacuum-sealed box. We'll call it the crucible doctrine. We teach the galaxy how to be stubborn. We teach them how to adapt to the adaptation. Valen was silent for a long time. He looked at the human woman, then at her broken brother and her grease-stained sister. He saw a species that had arrived as observers and had, within 72 hours, dismantled the fundamental philosophy of the coalition. I will take your proposal to the council, Valen said finally. But be warned, Dr. Thorne. The galaxy is a very old, very rigid place. Many will prefer the cold safety of entropy to the burning chaos of your world. Aris watched him walk away. Then they can stay in their boxes, she muttered. The rest of us have a bridge to build. Ilara walked over and leaned against her sister. You really want to invite the squids and the rock guys to Earth, Aris? Mom is going to flip when she sees who's coming for dinner. Aris laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound that felt like the first clean thing in the room. I think Mom can handle it, Ilara. She survived the great permafrost melt of 2088. Compared to that, a lithoderm in the living room is just a conversation piece. Jax reached out with his working hand and squeezed Aris's arm. Good work, Doc. You really stuck it to the brass. But don't get too comfortable. The scourge is still out there. And next time, they won't be surprised by a human with a loud voice. I know, Jax, Aris said, looking out at the Golden Fleet. But next time, we won't be 3 humans. We'll be a galaxy. As the first transport ships began to ferry the wounded toward the crucible, Aris Thorne took one last look at the white halls of the ossuary. She saw a Gale Stalker pup playing with a human child, their laughter echoing through the corridors. She saw the grit. She saw the dust. And for the first time in her life, she saw a future that wasn't written in the stars, but carved in the stubborn, beautiful earth. 3 months had passed since the siege of the ossuary, and the world of Sol 3, the Crucible, was living up to its name, too. In the shadow of the Andes Mountains, at a research station that had once been a lonely outpost for climate scientists, the first true multi-species city was being born. It wasn't a city of glass and gold. It was a city of reinforced concrete, geothermal vents, and high-tensile wind sails. It was a city built to be broken and rebuilt, again and again. Dr. Aris Thorne stood on a balcony overlooking the valley. The air was thin and crisp, the scent of pine needles mixing with the sulfurous tang of a nearby volcanic vent that the lithoderms had claimed as their embassy. Below her, the construction was constant. A team of human architects was working with lithoderm masons to create dwellings that could withstand a magnitude 9 earthquake. In the high ridges above, Gale stalkers were testing new gliders that utilized the erratic mountain thermals. Aris moved differently now. She no longer wore the stiff, academic suits of her former life. She wore rugged, multi-layered gear made of synthetic spider silk and recycled wool. Her movements were deliberate, a byproduct of the neural bridge that had left her with a permanent, intuitive sense of her surroundings. She didn't just see the mountain, she felt its mass. She didn't just hear the wind, she understood its direction. "Jax!" she called out, spotting her brother on the training grounds below. Jax Vance looked up, his new cybernetic arm gleaming in the harsh Andean sun. It wasn't a sleek, silver limb like the old one. It was a heavy-duty industrial model, matte black and reinforced with lithoderm-inspired plating. He was currently leading a joint defense force, a mixture of human Marines, Gale Stalker scouts, and even a few brave Sylph volunteers through a high-intensity endurance drill. 6 inches, Aris, Jax roared back, his grin wide and fierce. "We're doing a 10-mile hike with full packs. Want to join?" "I'll pass, Jax. I have a meeting with the High Council delegates," Aris shouted. She watched him for a moment, a sense of profound peace settling over her. Jax had found his purpose. He wasn't just a soldier anymore. He was a teacher. He was showing the galaxy that being a protector didn't mean being invulnerable. It meant being the one who stood up when everyone else was too tired to move. Ilara emerged from the laboratory door behind Aris, holding 2 steaming mugs. The smell of dark roast coffee hit Aris like a familiar embrace. "Here," Ilara said, handing her a mug. "I made it extra toxic today. Just the way the lithoderms like to watch us drink it." Aris took a sip, the heat and the caffeine blooming in her chest. "How is the neural bridge project coming along?" "It's messy," Ilara said, leaning against the railing. "We're finding that the human brain acts as a kind of universal translator for emotional grit. We can't share technical data yet. That's still too complex. But we can share the refusal to quit. We've successfully bridged a group of sylphs and lithoderms. They didn't kill each other. In fact, they started a book club." "A book club?" Aris asked, raising an eyebrow. "Well, a tactical book club," Ilara corrected. "They're studying ancient human siege warfare. It turns out the lithoderms are very fond of a guy named Sun Tzu." Aris looked out over the valley, watching the sun begin to set behind the jagged peaks. The sky was a bruised purple, the same color the scourge cloud had been. But here, it was a sign of a new day ending, not a world being erased. She thought back to the woman she had been on that Tuesday afternoon in New Geneva. That woman had been looking for answers in books, searching for the reason why civilizations failed. She had been an observer, a student of the end. Now she was a participant in the beginning. She reached out and touched the stone railing of the balcony. It was rough, uneven, and cold. In the old days, she would have called it an imperfection. Now she understood that the texture was the point. The roughness was what gave you a grip. The cold was what made the warmth of the coffee matter. She had learned that the most human thing you can do is not to build a perfect world, but to be the person who holds the door open when the world falls apart. She had learned that the bridge between species wasn't made of technology or treaties. It was made of the shared understanding that we are all just fragile things trying to make it to the next sunrise. I spent 40 years of my life believing that the mark of a great civilization was its ability to transcend its environment. I thought that being civilized meant being safe, being quiet, and being separate from the dirt and the blood of our origins. I looked at the golden ships of the coalition and saw the pinnacle of evolution. I looked at my own world, with its storms and its scars, and felt a quiet, lingering shame. I thought we were the galaxy's unfinished business, a species that had failed to master its own house. But standing on this mountain, watching a creature made of stone share a meal with a creature made of air, I finally see the truth. Evolution isn't about reaching a destination of perfect safety. It is about the struggle itself. Humanity's gift to the galaxy wasn't our technology or our art. It was our comfort with the uncomfortable. We are the species that knows how to find beauty in the rubble. We are the ones who can look at a Class 12 death world and call it home. Because we know that a world that doesn't try to kill you is a world that has stopped teaching you how to live. We were never meant to be observers. We were meant to be the glue. We were meant to be the stubborn, gritty, and deeply flawed bridge that connects the impossible extremes of the universe. I used to fear the dark spaces between the stars. Now I just see them as more ground to cover, 6 inches at a time. As the shadows lengthened over the crucible, Aris felt a familiar vibration in the floor, the distant, heavy footsteps of Craig Hewer returning from the geothermal mines. He stopped below her balcony and looked up, his orange eyes glowing like 2 small suns in the twilight. He didn't speak, but he raised a massive, stony hand in a silent salute. Aris raised her coffee mug in return. I wonder in your own life, when you feel the world shifting beneath your feet and the air getting thin, do you reach for the perfect, sterile solution that keeps you safe but alone? Or do you have the courage to reach into the mess, to grab the hand of the stranger you were told to fear, and build a bridge out of the very things meant to break you? Aris Thorne took a final sip of her coffee and walked inside to meet the future. The first star of the evening appeared above the Andes, bright and stubborn against the encroaching dark.